Hello, I'm Andrew Mazzoni, President of the Henry George School of Social Science. Welcome to Smart Talk. On this program, we will discuss controversial topics with leading economists from around the world. We think you will find them timely and compelling. Today's guest is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Dr. Roberts served as the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the Reagan administration and is noted as a co-founder of Supply Side Economics. His book, How the Economy Was Lost, presents his theory of how the U.S. economy has basically disintegrated in the last 30 years. Dr. Roberts, welcome to Smart Talk. Dr. Roberts, why don't you correct the supply side economics concept relative to Keynesianism as an opener here, because I think that's very important. Reaganomics gets a tag as some simplified trickle-down economics, and I think that if you correct the supply side aspect of it, we can go by the Reaganomics idea and get into the interview. But if you discuss your version of supply side economics and why it was so important as a correction of Keynesianism.
Well, it really goes back to the beginnings of the explanation of price formation. There was an argument between economists whether price was determined by the cost of production, that is by supply, or whether it was determined by demand, that is what people were willing to pay for it. And this argument went on until Alfred Marshall appeared and said that that argument is like arguing which blade of the scissors cuts the paper, that both supply and demand determine price. Well, it's that idea was missing in macroeconomics, because in the Keynesian model, monetary and fiscal policy only affect the aggregate demand curve. If you raise or lower taxes, you would shift demand. You would either increase consumer demand with a reduction in taxes, or you would reduce consumer demand with an increase in taxes. And what the supply side economists added was that changes in fiscal policy, such as changes in the marginal rate of taxation, can shift the aggregate supply schedule. And this was the completion then of macroeconomics. It got it off of the one blade of the scissors and brought in both blades of the scissors. And what the supply side economists were able to demonstrate, and this was later incorporated by Paul Samuelson into the 12th edition of his famous economics textbook, what we were able to show was that changes in marginal tax rates affect two important relative prices. One is the price that determines the trade-off between current consumption and saving. The higher the tax rate on investment income, the cheaper it is to consume in the present, because the higher the tax rate on investment income, the less future income you give up by consuming today. So if you were to lower the marginal tax rate, you would raise the opportunity cost of current consumption in terms of foregone future income. So this would encourage more savings for the future.
Okay, let me interject right there, because I think the point is clear. Now let's assume that applies in a closed economy, which the United States was around 1970 for the most part. All of a sudden, a dramatic shift has occurred, and it changed the dynamic of America significantly. And you are the economist that kind of pointed that out, and I want to start from that point moving forward. Why, all of a sudden, was it de rigueur to outsource all of a sudden out of our closed economy in a tremendous, unconstrained way, which of course would negate the balance of macroeconomic fine-tuning in our relatively closed economy. What accounted for this massive shift, and how important was it? I, as an old-line manufacturing executive who believes in keeping manufacturing and the learning by doing skills and the related companies in manufacturing together, was appalled at that outsourcing at the time. I was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company back in the day, in a manufacturing company to boot, and I saw what was being lost. Why then? And that in effect negates the goodness of supply and macro in a macro context, right there.
Well, the main event was the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it caused rethinking in China and in socialist India. And the two countries had closed economies to Western capital. But the collapse of the Soviet Union and the appearance of the end of history argument that there was no alternative now to American democratic capitalism, and it proved its superiority. This caused the China and India to open up their vast underutilized labor forces. And so American firms found, in fact, all first world firms, but initially, primarily the American ones, they found they could dramatically drop their labor cost by moving their manufacturing jobs to Asia. The next step in this was the rise of the high-speed internet, because that made it possible to also offshore tradable professional skills such as software engineering, research, design, the kinds of jobs that the American college graduates formerly could look forward to. These could now be moved offshore.
Well, let me say this. Let me interject there, Dr. Roberts. Okay, that's an obvious move, but if we look at American history was able to compete with high wages and high labor for 200 years without necessarily offshoring its manufacturing capability, and could compete with high labor costs. By arbitraging, let's say, labor, for example, wouldn't the economic planners in Washington know that they would create an imbalance? There would be no purchasing power corresponding to those low wages to come back and clear any products that came in without inflating loans and debt as the contra. And ultimately, that would hollow out an economy. That had to be a known effect. Yes or no?
No, there's no evidence that it was known. In fact, it's still denied. In fact, quite rigorously denied, because the offshoring of jobs is interpreted as the operation of free trade. And therefore, the claims are made that it is mutually beneficial and that the United States is benefiting from the offshoring of these jobs.
But the fallacy, of course, is free trade theory. Ricardo's free trade theory assumes not moving capital, for example, along with a free trade concept. Once you undermine your own economy, all bets are off as to the benefits of free trade. I think Gomery conclusively proves that.
Yes, that's true. The free trade theory is problematic even in its own terms. And it's also true that the free trade theory requires that a country seek its comparative advantage at home. It finds out where its comparative advantage is at home. And therefore, that implies the capital stays at home and finds the most effective use. And offshoring is not pursuit of comparative advantage, it's pursuit of absolute advantage. They're looking for the lowest factor costs. And so it is not free trade. And I'm not saying that it is. I'm saying that it is interpreted as free trade by the economics profession.
Who should know better,
They should know better, but and maybe they don't, or maybe they're shills for the offshoring.
Well, let me give you a scenario that, of course, Henry George was a free trader, but he was a free trader in a world that had comparabilities. You know, one country didn't have a demonstrable intellectual advantage or material advantage over another, and you could get away with it. I'm a restricted free trader, basically because of the problem you pointed out. But let's assume that this occurred and America is being hollowed out and jobs are being arbitraged away. I'm a New York guy. I'm an investment banker. I'm a Washington guy. I'm a military guy. I'm a Boston guy. I'm a technology guy. Those three cities are kind of the nexus of a very interesting compilation of power, wealth, money, brains. And if I look at us as kind of an island that's basically trades with the world, is arbitrages factors all over the world, for us, this is not so bad what you've pointed out. The rest of the country may suffer, may become a North Argentina. But for the big guys in these areas, why should they worry about the things you point out and the things I agree with? Interesting. Any comments on that?
Well, for the CEOs themselves, it's in their interest because their interests, generally speaking, are short term. I don't think there are very many public corporations in which the CEO comes in to office at a young age and stays there for 10 or 20 or 30 years. And so most of them come in when they're about 60, and they have a few years in which to really make their fortune before they retire. And so for them, if you can drop your labor costs by offshoring your jobs, your profits go up, and therefore your bonus component of your salary, which is the largest component, goes up. And so you can maximize your income by offshoring the jobs. Now, as you have already noted earlier in our conversation, the aggregate effect over time is to destroy the American consumer market, because the people who were working in, say, textile, apparel manufacturing, making maybe $35,000, $40,000 a year, they end up working as retail clerks for $16,000 a year. And the difference in their income essentially kills off any discretionary spending capability.
Well, if I can borrow the money, if I can borrow the difference, if monetary authorities are accommodative, allow me to inflate mortgage demand, credit card demand, I can defer the devastating effects for maybe 30 or 40 years, which I think occurred. That being the case, would you agree that that's the case?
No, it can't defer that long. And this policy is what Alan Greenspan used when he saw that there wasn't any growth in real median family income, and therefore there was nothing to drive the economy. That is when Greenspan, as Fed chairman, initiated the credit expansion that substituted the growth in consumer debt for the missing growth in consumer income. So that's how, in the early part of this new century, the early part of the 21st century, they were able to keep the consumer demand growing and to keep some growth in the economy. But very quickly, of course, debt reached its limit. People can't acquire debt indefinitely when their income's not growing. And when the ability of people to acquire any more debt ran out, the bubble broke, the real estate market collapsed, and the economy really hasn't done anything since. So it's a short-term step you can use to substitute the growth in consumer debt for missing growth in consumer.
Let me just comment on that. I think that's clear, but again, I'm a New York, Boston, and Washington guy. I mean, we're military, we're finance, we're technology, we're international. Why should I worry? about the lack of purchasing power in the hinterlands. I'm being the devil's advocate here. Since I'm insulated, I think, from that. My money's ready to go anywhere. I'm ready to travel to London, Frankfurt, Berlin, any place, and get away from the effects of, let's say, a downsizing of the American middle and working class. And where were the middle class and working people politically in stopping or seeing or avoiding this, in effect, catastrophe?
Well, first of all, you can't escape it because it eventually comes back to you in the dollar's loss of value. Because if your economy isn't growing, but your debt is, and you're having to issue more debt to finance the federal budget, but you also have to issue more debt in order to keep the banks that are too big to fail from failing. And so the world is flooded with the issue of dollars in debt, but not with an increase in the real output of American goods and services that match the growth in the supply of dollars and the supply of debt. The pressure then builds on the dollar itself, builds on its exchange value, and builds on its role as reserve currency. And then you see people, because the rest of the world has been accumulating dollars since the end of World War II. They have a tremendous amount of dollars, and when they see what looks to be no end into the supply of new dollars is not matched by the output of goods and services, they say, what is happening to the value of our dollar-based assets? And do we want to keep acquiring them? And you see then the countries pull back from purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds. You see them looking for alternative stores of value, such as gold. We see the enormous accumulation of gold now in Asia. We see pressure on the dollar from the rising price of gold. You know, during the 21st century, we've seen an enormous increase in the price of gold, peaking in 2011. And what have we seen since is the Federal Reserve realizes that the rising price of gold is a threat to the dollar and to the Fed's policy of quantitative easing, and therefore they suppress the rising price of gold by selling naked shorts. They dump massive amounts of futures contracts, on the market in the least tradable periods when there's actually no trading going on, and they come in and dump huge quantities of contracts and drive down the price. And that then produces stop loss orders, it produces margin calls, more sales, and this is the way they've controlled the price of gold since 2011.
You would argue that a reserve currency is the sine qua non of American staying power. And I think we would fight to maintain the dollar as a reserve currency, because what would our alternative be? As long as we keep the reserve currency and payments for oil in the American dollar, we could probably do this indefinitely. What do you think?
No, because the world is moving away from it. We've seen the formation of the BRICS, Brazil and Russia, China, India, South Africa. That's about half of the world's population. They're forming up their own banks, their own reserve systems. They're going to transact their foreign trade with one another without using dollars. We've seen the energy policy that Russia and China recently came to terms on. There's going to be no dollar use in the sale of Russian energy to China. So we see increasingly countries moving away from using the dollar and the dollar payment system. And the United States is driving them away by its use of sanctions. The only reason the United States can sanction a country is because of the dollar payment system. If the country is not part of the dollar payment system, it can't be sanctioned. And we see that the Russian response to the huffing and puffing in Washington about sanctions on Russia was to arrange the deal with China, in which the biggest energy deal of all time has no dollar role. So I think this is going to increase. I think the dollar is in trouble, and I think that its abuse, it's the way Washington abuses the role by threatening countries, imposing sanctions, seizing their assets. Look what they recently did to the big French bank. They stole $9 billion of the French bank. They're now doing the same thing to the big bank in Germany, the Commerzbank. So Washington really is starting to even create opposition to it among its European puppet states.
Let me ask you this then, Paul. Why did we allow, American policymakers allow it to reach this point?
Because
they could have brought back American manufacturing. They could have changed tax laws to encourage it. They could have stopped it. They could have made all the offshore corporations like Apple, who have hordes of cash offshore, they could force all of that back and force manufacturing, the source of really wealth and jobs for most people, back in the home territory if they wanted to, I believe. Your comment on that?
Well, first of all, they have to recognize the problem. And they don't. I wrote this book, The Failure of Laissez-Faire Capitalism and Economic Dissolution of the West. I laid it all out. It's never been reviewed in an economics journal or in the mainstream media. It's reviewed all over the place on the internet and Amazon. And nobody in Washington has contacted me to say, wow, this is a serious problem. What can we do about it? And instead, the economics profession pretends that no such thing is happening. So you can say they're either completely stupid or they speak for interest groups that benefit from it.
Okay, well, let's stop it right there. I mean, I assume that our government policy planners are not stupid at all. And our corporations are not stupid.
But they are, I can tell you. I was among them
well,
for a number
okay.
of years. I was one of them. They are stupid.
Well, generally
They're
speaking...
completely stupid in this sense. They're not stupid in terms of serving their own interests in helping some private interest group that then will look after them when they leave government service. They're very clever in those ways. But in terms of thinking about the longevity of the country and the success through time of the country, they really have no incentive to do that.
That's the point. I would argue, I'm an investment banker in New York. You're a 60 years old guy. I'm making a lot of money. My money's international. I'm everywhere. I own corporations all over the world. I'm not wedded to a particular country. I don't care. I know I'm going to die in 20 years. I'm living it up now. Why should I care about anybody or anything when I've got my pile now? In a way, it's kind of the attitude. Why would I care? And who's going to make me care?
It is the attitude. And, it developed over the course of my lifetime. I remember when I was in university, and we were taught that a corporation had responsibilities to shareholders, but it also had responsibilities to its employees, to its customers, and to its local communities. And that the function of a CEO was to balance all of these responsibilities.
Absolutely. I grew up in that same era.
Now, but by 1990, if not before, the argument is corporations are only responsible to the shareholders. They have no other responsibility, none to communities, none to their employees, and none to the customers. They are responsible to shareholders, and therefore they must always focus on increasing shareholder returns. And Wall Street enforced this with the threat, if you don't move offshore to China and get your profits up, we're going to finance a takeover of your company. So even executives that didn't want to abandon their home communities were forced to by the threat of Wall Street. So the whole attitude of the executive class changed, and it no longer saw any responsibility other than the bottom line. And so if I can close down all my factories and send all the manufacturing abroad, and in fact, I can become a factoryless manufacturer. I don't even manufacture them abroad. I outsource it. That's what Apple does.
Yes, absolutely.
They don't even, and so we now have this new concept of factoryless manufacturers, and what they're trying to do in Washington right now is to redefine Apple's outsourced, offshored output as U.S. manufacturing.
Okay.
So that they can boost the share of manufacturing in the reports, so that they can boost manufacturing employment, because then all of Apple's employees become manufacturing employees, even though they don't have a factory. And all of Apple's exports, say, of iPhones to Europe, they become counted as American exports. And the Apple computers and iPhones that come into the United States are no longer counted as imports. They are U.S. manufacturing output. So this is what they're trying to do right now as we speak.
But that's contrary to all accounting. All accounting in history for GNP calculations, it's an absurdity on the face of it. I mean, you just don't do that. It's not. It's worse than hedonic pricing.
They tend to do it. They tend to do
I can understand why, but all the benefits of
public comment.
But all the benefits of
a lot of
the
people
labor
have defended it. Other people are attacking it.
Well, then that begs the question: what were the American people doing during this 30-year period where this was occurring? In their own best interests, basically, were being sacrificed.
What could they do? When they're told that, first of all, you may be hurting, but overall we're benefiting. That free trade always hurts a few people, but the general impact is to increase the overall welfare. So more people are benefiting than the few of you who are hurting. This was part of so they were told this. So what could they do?
Well, the income statistics belie that. The distribution of income is direct evidence that that's not true.
Well, I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying what they were told. Now, and of course, the people aren't statisticians, and they don't know how to go find the evidence. But this is what the mainstream media would tell them. And then the next thing they were told is, well, it's just a question of retraining. You need to be retrained. But of course, any professional, tradable professional skill can be offshored as well. So there's really nothing to retrain to. And so they just got one line after the other. We had this study by Michael Porter at Harvard for the Competitiveness Council, and he came out with this big study and claimed that this showed that the United States was benefiting greatly from jobs offshoring.
He's simply wrong.
Of course he's wrong. I attacked the study, and they replied to it, and I replied to that. But they simply ignore anything that doesn't suit them. We had Matthew Slaughter. He was on the Council of Economic Advisors for President Bush. He came out with a study that proved that offshoring jobs increased American jobs. Now, the way he proved this was he did not control for the fact that transnational corporations were buying up other corporations and adding existing jobs to their workforce. He counted that, you see, as an increase in employment from offshoring. He didn't control for the fact that some companies that had never before conducted affairs overseas started doing that. So he counted that as jobs created by offshoring. So in other words, it was a fake study. Well, they do these things constantly. There are more of these coming up than you can expose. And so why do they do it? Well, my supposition is that corporate income, corporate grants to departments is a very important part of academic life. And so to get the money, they serve the masters who bring it. And they're rewarded with grants to the departments. They're rewarded with speaking fees, speaking engagements. Some of them even get put on corporate boards. And so they have become a spokesman for a policy that is destroying the country.
Dr. Roberts, let me interject there. I mean, the American people can look at American history for a guide as to the correct course of action. If I go back to America, the time of Alexander Hamilton, he makes the observations that no agricultural country, hewers of wood and so forth, could ever be a first-rate country. So he simply advocates manufacturing, even if it's inefficient on the homeland, and put up tariffs against manufacturing coming in. And America does this, and it goes from a nothing country in 1800 till by 1870, it's the leading manufacturing country in the world. And it does it by growing its own manufacturing, growing its own skills, learning by doing. Of course, it had a fortunate benefit of being a country safe from invasion and a wide open frontier, so that labor, if you pushed it down too far, could move west on you, forcing wages to be relatively high. And it created a virtuous cycle of higher wages, lower rents because you could move away from it, autonomous manufacturing because you're keeping everybody out, and in the course of 70 years, you create an industrial colossus. Why would you violate those rules now, unless it was for reasons of nationality or nationalism, or a country doesn't count anymore in international reckoning?
Well, I wouldn't, but I didn't have any say about it. And you see, actually what happened was new in history. There never before had been an opportunity to find massive supplies of labor at a tiny fraction of the cost of domestic labor. For example, when this offshoring of jobs began, U.S. manufacturing workers were making maybe $25 an hour, and the American corporations could hire a Chinese at 25 cents an hour. Now look at the difference. You can see the leverage that does to profits.
Okay, but
all the success indicators.
Look at Germany. Germany competes very well with labor higher than ours and sells to China and all over.
Well, Andy, offshoring had nothing to do with competing. It's true the United States did not need to offshore in order to be competitive, because the United States had the technology and the capital and the business know-how. And China and India did not have those things until the American corporations took them there. So offshoring was not a response to competitiveness. There was no danger to American competitiveness. It was purely greed. It was purely the drive for higher profits.
Why didn't the Germans do that then?
I think because the unions there are much stronger and that the whole attitude of the country is different. And I don't think they went through the redefinition of what the manager's responsibility is. I don't think the German manager has been shorn of his obligation to the labor force, to his customers, to the communities as they were here. So it was the rise of this notion that nobody has a claim on the corporation except the owners. And whatever happens to anybody else, as long as it benefits the owners, then the manager is doing what he's supposed to do. I don't think that has permeated, though it's beginning to permeate.
Yeah, but I agree that that's a fair statement. In France, Germany, Sweden, Norway, and so forth. All of this being said, what possibilities do the average American person have to rekindle a decent standard of living?
None, because they can't affect anything by voting.
That's true, okay.
And so we've seen that over and over. Mm-hmm. All the hopes that were part of the election of Obama, all of them were disappointed, and nothing changed. Whether it's a Democrat or Republican, they serve the same interest groups. There are about 6 powerful private interest groups, and they run the country. They determine the laws that Congress passes, the bills that the president signs. Their campaign contributions determine who's in office, not our votes. So the 6 groups, they are the people to whom the government is responsible. It's not responsible to the voters. It's responsible to Wall Street, to the military security complex, of which President Dwight Eisenhower warned us long ago, 1960. They are, the government is responsible to agribusiness. You can see this so total. I mean, Monsanto, you can't even get labeling that this is a genetically modified food. You can't even get the labeling because of the power of Monsanto. And then when states do it, like Vermont, Monsanto steps in with lawsuits. Then we have, of course, the extractive industries, timber, mining, energy. Look at the fracking that's going on. In my opinion, the external or social cost of fracking is greater than the value of the oil and gas. They're destroying the water tables, the surface water, the underground water. We don't know what are the other consequences of all of the disruption of the underground structures, earthquakes.
But again, consistent with the current thesis, if I can get my money out now and I can move it someplace else, I'm not going to worry about it, is the current zeitgeist, I would argue.
Yes. You have a hard time moving it somewhere else.
Yeah. What happens if China, Russia, they create their own blocks and their own insularity, and American influence somehow is shut down from those areas, and it has to back up on, let's say, the Americas for sustenance? How do you think that would play out? They can't. The capital has to go somewhere. The purchasing power of, let's say, North and South America are basically devastated. Where do you go if you can't ultimately go to China and Russia and India, because they build up their own autarkic structures and their own reserve currency? Where does that leave not only the financiers of America, along with the ordinary people? Where can they go? Which way do they turn?
That remains to be seen. They may not be able to go much of anywhere. If you look at the new rules that the IRS is laying down, what do they call it now? The FATCA or something like FATCA, where any foreign financial institution that has any American deposit has such enormous compliance costs that many of them are saying, we don't want any dollar deposits. Don't bring us any dollars. My son was in graduate school in England and could not find an English bank that would accept his account. Finally, the university had to persuade a bank to provide banking for its foreign students. So this, and these new regulations that they're already in effect, but they start biting very hard next July, July of 2015, because that's when the huge fines and impositions of felonies start applying to foreign institutions who don't comply with all the compliance costs of having dollar accounts. So we're creating a situation where these people with the money can't take it anywhere because nobody wants it. And we also have a situation, Andy, where one of the main support system today for the dollar is that Japan is an American puppet state and the EU is an American puppet state. And so we can prevail on Japan and the EU to inflate the yen and the euro to keep the pressure off the dollar. Well, how long can we do that before the adverse consequences on Japan and the EU of inflating their own currencies to cover up the inflation of the American currency? At some point, they can't do this forever when they don't benefit and they're simply having to serve their imperial master. So at some point, that stops.
But as long as we control the oil, let's assume we control the oil and energy, and we can price that to buy our way through this problem. Your comments on that?
We don't control the oil and energy. Not in any way do we control it. I mean, the Russians have tremendous energy reserves. We don't control the energy reserves in Iraq or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela. South America is essentially leaving the American orbit. If you saw the recent BRICS conference in Brazil, all the South American countries are there with Russia and China. People are tired of American bullying. The United States gave up diplomacy a long time ago. It has no diplomacy. It has threats and coercion. Do as we say, or we'll bomb you into the Stone Age. That's what we tell people. Do as we say, or we'll impose sanctions on you. Do as we say, or we'll invade. This is not diplomacy, and it's created angry responses all over the world to Washington, and people are looking for ways to get away from Washington. So now we see two very strong, powerful countries, Russia and China, forming up to offer the rest of the world a different kind of leadership. And that's the big change that's going on. That's what's going to affect everything, is that if you look at Putin, he doesn't say, do as I say, I'll bomb you in the Stone Age. He says, I'm here for you. We can work out something to our mutual benefit. I'm here for you. He says it